Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. The talk that I'll give you, or presentation, probably speak for 30 or 40 minutes, but I could talk for hours depending on how busy you want to be. It's a visual summary of the book Vodka in a Vegemite Jar, and the explanation for the title is part of the story. I describe it as a collision between science and adventure and history and humanity, because all of those elements is really what the book is about. When I read this book by Cherry Garrard, I thought those words could have been mine. This is a story that I basically didn't talk about for 40 years. And when you see some of the pictures, you'll probably wonder why not, but it's not an easy topic to actually bring up after dinner. And anyway, I'm enjoying the opportunities and experience to talk to people like we are doing today. So let me start. Antarctica, now I'm talking to a geographic society, so you probably know a lot more about this place than the average group that I speak to. But just to quickly summarise, Antarctica is almost twice the size of Australia. And I'll use this lovely pointer here. If you're a tourist, you would have been to, technical issue. Well, I'm just wondering how to turn that pointer on. Oh, there.
Okay, here it is.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so if you're a tourist, you would have been to the Antarctic Peninsula. Has anyone here been to Antarctica, by the way? You have. In what is a flight or a ship? Ship. Yeah. So you would have been over to that side of South American side of the peninsula, I would imagine. Yeah. So of course, I'm talking in this presentation about the other side on East Antarctica. So to quickly explain, in 1978, I went to Casey, which is near where the pointer is, the Australian station, and Mawson, the more commonly known station, is higher up on that map. In 1978, I spent a year there. We travelled inland on a traverse shown by that black line, which is about 900 kilometres to 74 degrees south. And my job was a glaciologist. So to quickly explain what I was actually doing, I was trying to gather information on the surface ice velocity, the ice depth, and the accumulation of snow at the surface. So these are just basic parameters that we tried to gather over the decades to understand the dynamics of the East Antarctic ice sheet. So after I did that in 1978, I had an opportunity to go with the Russians on the traverse shown by that red line from Muni, which is here, to Dome C, which is at the end of the line, a distance of 1,500 kilometres each way. Yeah, so that's equivalent to travelling from Byron Bay to Townsville and back, which is quite a long way. You probably know that the magnetic South Pole is at a very different point to the geographic South Pole. So that's where Scott went to, and Amundsen, of course, who beat him. And the magnetic South Pole was down here. And it's currently moving northwesterly every year at a rate of about 10 to 15 kilometres per year. Before I left on the trip to Muni, from Muni to Dome C, I went to Vostok for a day. So I'll show you pictures of all these things in a few minutes. The Antarctic is totally different to the Arctic. So I'm sure that you probably understand that, but when you look at pictures, you kind of get that real, you really get the drift of what I'm talking about. We all recognise this as Greenland here. Well, Greenland has an ice sheet like Antarctica. Of course, the ice sheet is freshwater ice, but the Arctic ice that we commonly understand is frozen seawater, which is typically between 1 to 4 metres thick. It can ridge up to like 10 or 15 metres thick, where the ice flows ridge up together due to wind and tides. However, typically it's only a few metres thick. The Antarctic ice cap is on average 2.5 kilometres thick. So we're talking about totally different things. And the and the Greenland ice sheet, again, where the pointer is here, is only about an eighth of the size of the East Antarctic ice sheet. It's very small in comparison to Antarctica. So that dotted line, the black dotted line, is the Arctic Circle. And you can see quickly visually there that the Arctic really includes all of the northerly extremes of quite a few different continents, and it constrains the extent to which Arctic sea ice can expand. So there's big differences between the nature of the Arctic and the Antarctic. But of course, we all know that the Arctic ice, including Greenland and all of the glaciers around the world, are in strong retreat and melting. And the other big thing is that the Antarctic East Antarctic ice sheet is actually growing. So I mentioned, many of you probably didn't know that. Anyway, this is a little dot point summary of what I just said, and it shows where Australia is in relation to the rest of the stations I just talked about in Antarctica. Actually, we just pulled a map out there of that looks like the surface topography of the Antarctic, which would be great to have a good look at later. So it shows that line that we travelled on from Muni to Dome Sea here, 1,500 kilometres. So in cross section, this is what the Antarctic looks like across that line you can see from west to east. And the West Antarctic ice sheet is very small in comparison to the East Antarctic ice sheet. And there's convenient dividing line, which is the Transantarctic Mountains, which is approximately along the prime meridian. But the East Antarctic ice sheet is approximately 70% of all of the world's or the Earth's freshwater resources are in the East Antarctic ice sheet. 70%, 90% of the world's ice is in the East Antarctic ice sheet, or 70% of all of the world's freshwater resources. Phenomenal. So when you think about that, you understand that it's very important that we try to understand as best we can what's happening with the mass balance of that ice sheet. The mass balance meaning the amount that's coming in versus the amount that's going out. And my next slide, I'll show you that. But I'd like to just explain that size and dimension of the Antarctic here. And you can see from the dividing lines over on the left here, those dashes there, that they're kilometres, not metres, kilometres. So the average ice thickness is 2.5 kilometres in the East Antarctic, 2.5 kilometres. And the average elevation is something like similar, about 2.1 to 2.5. That's phenomenal. I mean, Mount Kosciuszko, who can tell me how high Mount Kosciuszko is?
2,300.
Perfect, you know the answer. So it's almost exactly the same as the average height of the East Antarctic ice sheet. The deepest ice in Antarctica, who'd like to guess what that is?
4 or 5 kilometres.
Ah, yes, you know geography. 4.9, it is nearly 5 kilometres deep. What's your name? So now I'm going to teach you all about glaciology. So it's just a big dome of ice, and the ice, the snow falls in the middle and the ice mass builds up. But it isn't just snow as we commonly understand snowfall. A lot of it is due to sublimation or the ice freezing and skipping the liquid stage, just going from air to solids. So you're growing ice crystals within the surface of the ice snow. And under the weight of its own mass, it flows by deformation out to the edges, shown by those dashed lines and arrows. Of course, in the central region where it's much thicker, you get very small amount of sliding over the base. But as you get towards the coast, the ice mass gets thinner, it moves a lot faster, it spreads out, and of course the sliding starts to occur as it gets towards the outlet glaciers. So the ice then zooms out through glaciers, breaks off as iceberg and floats away. So that's the cycle. And that's the key question that scientists are really interested in. I said before that the ice mass is getting bigger. Well, that's interesting and great, and it's comforting, but we really want to know, is it in balance or not? Are we just looking at a small snapshot in geological time, or is it, is that cycle in balance? And that's very difficult to sort out. And even today, the conclusion is not much different to what I wrote in my MSc thesis in 1986, which was quite a long time ago, where I said that the East Antarctic ice sheet is unlikely to be out of balance by about more than plus or minus 10%, which was just a thumb suck. So now science actually can't do much better than that, even with all the technology we currently have. But at the end of this presentation, I'll show you some ways in which we might hope to improve on that understanding. So now we're at 1983. Guess who that is? That's my wife, Kerry. He still looks exactly the same, in my eyes anyway. And we all recognise that Hobart and the Naladan, on which I travelled to Mawson. So Kerry was 25 years old then. I was 29. We'd been married for 10 months and off I went. Kerry, yeah, I know. Well, that's what the conversation after the presentation can investigate a bit more. But I left and Kerry thought I was never coming back. And one of the reasons was because I had to actually walk down the gangplank to board Naladan, down the gangplank. And Kerry was mortified by that. And Kerry keeps talking about the rust that she saw on the ship. I never noticed any rust. And then off I went. And 2 weeks later, I arrived at Mawson. And that's me standing there in my blue overalls. And the picture tells the story. That's an Aleutian 14 aircraft, obviously Aeroflot. And it had flown across from Meaney to pick me up at Mawson and take me back to Meaney. Now, I'm wearing sunglasses and a beanie. And I mentioned before, Kerry thought she was never going to see me again. And this is another reason, which was proof. The reason was not because of the sunshine and the cold, was because I'd had an accident on the quad bike the night before. And I didn't want them to see this huge black eye I had and a big grazed forehead and 7 stitches in the top of my head. And I was actually feeling very groggy because I hadn't had any sleep the night before. Yeah. So, but that was only one of several, and you'll see more reasons why Kerry's premonition was not far from coming to fruition. When the Russians arrived, it was a beautiful day. You can't really see it in the picture, although it's obviously not blowing or anything, but it was a beautiful, clear blue sky. And they wanted to have a look around the station because that's a picture back in the day when they were just starting the rebuilding program. And there's sort of a new generation of buildings starting to occur now at Mawson. So we went off to look around. No one could speak to each other. There was a lot of pointing and slapping on the back and laughing and holding up fingers. And they wanted to look at the dogs in particular, which was what we were doing at that point. And Mawson had just had a new litter of puppies. So that guy on the second from the left, his name was this guy here, Sergikov. He was the officer in charge. And he immediately seized the moment and asked if they could take a puppy back to Meaney as a pet. Because they did have a pet who passed away, apparently, I don't know how recently. But the dog handler, I think it was this guy on the right here, his name was Dale. And the doctor, they had a conversation and decided that maybe a puppy was not a good idea, but rather they would offer them a young dog called Snoopy. And the reason was because of the personality of the animals. They felt this dog here might be more suited to life as a pet. They are wild animals, so in a puppy, you just don't know what you're going to get. So they gave the dog a couple of sedatives and injections, and off we went. And we flew back to Meaney in this aircraft here, the Aleutian 14. So does that aircraft ring a bell for any of you in terms of what it looks like?
A Fokker.
No, you're on the right track. Does Douglas DC-3 sound familiar?
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, that good.
Because it isn't actually a Douglas DC-3, but it was a derivative of those aircraft built in the Soviet Union under license from Douglas Corporation back in the 60s. And they're still flying these sort of aircraft, probably still are today. Of course, it's sitting up on skis with a nose wheel instead, with a nose ski. And the DC3, if you remember, had a tail wheel. It's a tail dragger. That's right. And inside that, which you can't see, there weren't 30 or 40 seats. There were seats for 6 people, and the rest of the fuselage were big fuel tanks for long range. But otherwise, it looked like a DC3. Inside the aircraft, the radio operator there was tapping away on Morse code. So my first impressions getting into the aircraft, feeling a bit groggy and just looking around and everything, trying to take it in, if you can imagine. It was just an incredible experience because I was on my own then. It was like getting into a spacecraft and heading off to the International Space Station as far as I was concerned. And to see the radio operator tapping away on Morse code, beep, 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 beep. I thought, what the hell? This is 1983. What are you doing with Morse code? But I didn't really understand. And on the left, though, we were talking earlier about a totalizator and using abacus and whatever. This guy on the left, the navigator, had a slide rule on his table. I thought, oh, that's a good sign. And in the yes, yeah, we all know how to use a slide rule, but I mean, I went through uni using a slide rule and 7-figure log tables, but this is 1983, In the roof there is the astro compass, so that wasn't too unusual. That was quite expected. After I got to Muni, within a day or two, it was just before Christmas in 1983, and the vehicles weren't quite ready to go out on the Traverse, so I seized the opportunity to ask if I could go to Vostok, not for a scenic flight, but because we had a snow movement marker at Vostok that had been established 7 years earlier, and it was of really keen interest to remeasure that location and hence the ice movement, which was a key data point in our program. So that's me arriving on the skiway in Vostok. You can see the compressed snow, the shadow of the wing. But look at Vostok. Now, this is the coldest place on Earth. And they're fiberglass, they're, plywood buildings with kerosene heating. So another question for you guys. They recorded the world record minimum temperature on the 21st of July, 1983. It's still in the Guinness Book of Records. What do you think it is?
-45.
You're not even close.
-80.
What, Fahrenheit or centigrade?
Centigrade.
You know a lot, yeah. It's -89.2. So, and apparently on the ground, unofficially it was -90, but officially in the Stevenson screen, and it's in the Guinness Book Records, -89.2, and it still hasn't been exceeded. So these guys that were here that I came to meet had lived through that period. And that's me at Vostok. And I, of course, had this smashed head. So flying from sea level to 4,300 meters in the space of a few hours, I arrived there like a piece of jelly. I couldn't walk. I had, like the worst case of concussion and altitude sickness you can imagine. I spent the 2 days I was there basically lying down and vomiting. But of course, after the 2 hours, I had nothing to vomit up, but that's how I felt. And this was just before we came back, and I could actually, was strong enough to stand up and walk around. So the sign here on the left, that says Vostok here. There's the skiway. You can see the little flags and the marker and the flag. Of course, it's different. It's blue and yellow today, Russian flag. That says welcome to Vostok. And this thing here, that's the arrivals and departures. This is Vostok today. You couldn't imagine. And until 2 years ago, it was like the former picture. Now this is a new Vostok, which I only found by accident. But I think our old mate Vladimir's up to no good here. Looks like the International Space Station, doesn't it? And obviously a completely different engineering achievement. Huge. I don't know much about it other than that's what it looks like. So going back to 1983, there I was, just before we left, it was time for drinks and a snack. And you can see the lovely things we had to choose from, the cup of tea here, and there's caviar and all kinds of dried fish but you can see the black eye that I was talking about if you look, and the smashed head. And even just the way I'm sitting there, I was really in a bad way. I really felt bad. The guy in the blue at the front was Dr. Slava. He'd wintered at Vostok, but he'd come back to Mirny, and he travelled with me just to make sure that I was able to, survive, just to look after me for that weekend, because he knew I was going to be in big trouble. This guy here, Budretsky, was the officer in charge. And you can see in the window shelf here, a little hydroponic setup there. I think that they would have been tomatoes or herbs or something. When we set off on the Traverse, we travelled in 2 tractor trains. So I've been to Mawson on Neladan, 2-week voyage, then flown to Mirny, and then we've flown to Vostok and back, and now we're about to set off on this overland voyage, and it's Christmas Eve. This vehicle here is called a Kharkovchenka, and the sled at the back is a fuel set, bulk fuel set. I think I don't know how much it held, but a lot. Kharkovchenka means the little lady from Kharkov City, and Lila can tell me if I got that wrong. But I did learn to speak Russian back then, and that's part of the story. By the time I got home, I was actually able to converse with people reasonably comfortably, not technically or not fast. I couldn't read a magazine or books, but I could chat and speak to people. Of course, today I can't. The other thing about this picture, which is interesting, is you see on the snow pole, there's an antenna here, and you can't see probably in the picture the wire. Oh, yes, you can, the wire going back to the inside the van. So that was my job in action. The antenna was part of the JMR Doppler. It was the first generation of GPS, Global Positioning System, but we had this Doppler survey unit called JMR that had only just been released for civilian use in about 1976. So 5 or so, 6 years later, very early, leading edge, high tech. So we would use the US Navy navigation satellites, would be transmitting signals received by the antenna on a magnetic tape, which would be processed back in Australia when you got home, to determine an accurate position for that snow pole. So the idea was you'd stick a pole in the snow, measure the position, come back a few years later, remeasure it, and just calculate the displacement over time, and you've got surface ice velocity. So these were really key pieces of information that are still important today. The other tractor train is shown in this picture. It's the same primary vehicle, except it doesn't have a living van on the back. So the RTT is an acronym that in Russian it means an artillery tractor, and which they would use in normal life, if you put it that way, for military purposes, towing around guns and ammunition and whatever. In this case, they're towing our living van at the back. The living van is called a Balok, and inside you'll see a picture in a moment. Pretty luxurious. This is the cabin of both the Kharkovchenka and the RTT, and Valery, the chief mechanic's sitting there driving the thing. But look at it, there's dials and levers and pedals, and very mechanical, no fancy electronics, and really rough ride, but the noise, which you can't see in the picture, was just unbelievable. You spend a day sitting up there in the cabin, and by the end of the day, when you get out, I did anyway, tinnitus. It ringing in the ears for about 3/4 of an hour afterwards, just from the noise. The roar of the engine, the heat, was just incredible. So there's our lovely tractor train in the background there, but this picture is really about Vlad, and who was our team leader. There were 9 of us on this Traverse. Vlad was in charge. He was a magnetologist by profession. And what he's doing there is doing a manual measurement of the Earth's magnetic field. So in a moment, you'll see that the real program was about deploying automatic instruments, but every now and then he'd do a manual check of that to calibrate, I guess, the automatic stations. So that's what he's doing here. These are the automatic remote stations. They're powered by 1 gram of selenium, so they're radio isotope, like medical technology type things, encased in lead. And I like saying and telling people that we were really poorly provisioned in terms of spare parts. We didn't have any spare parts. We didn't have any tools. We had the poorest food. We had just absolutely really rubbish, but we had a Geiger counter, which was the all-important instrument, because the other guys were quite worried about the radioactive issues. Anyhow, here they are deploying one of the stations. There were 7 on the route from Munich to Dome C. So what he was trying to do, actually, which you might find interesting, was correlate sunspot activity and solar flares with the effects on the magnetic field around in the global magnetic field in this cusp region of the interplanetary field near the south geomagnetic pole. So it's very confusing. You know, there's a south pole, which we haven't really got time, but we can talk about it later. But the south magnetic pole, where the compass needle points, is a totally different place to where the interplanetary field converges over the surface of the Earth.
Was that left behind each time?
The magnetic station.
Yeah, they'd do that.
Yeah, they'd leave it behind, and they'd come back every year. That's what this Travis was all about. And they would change the film canisters because they were recording the data on 35mm film, do any maintenance, and they would also decommission some of them and put new ones in depending on how they were going with the program. So they did that over a period of a decade or so until they eventually, I think our Travis was the second last. I think they wrapped it all up a year or two later. So sometimes people will ask me, what's it like, the feeling of being cold? And this picture explains better than words what it feels like. Because the vapor in your, or the moisture in your breath as you exhale forms those ice globs on your beard. And it was quite common, you'd just, break a piece off and suck on it like an ice cube in your drinks, and for moisture, so recycling. And the other problem when it got really cold, and actually Budreski told me about this at Vostok, where they had problems with your eyes, your eyelids would freeze together. So, it sounds very dramatic, but the solution is pretty simple. You just, cup your hands over your face and exhale and thaw out a bit. But of course, what you have to look out for is white patches on the nose and fingers and whatever in really cold conditions in terms of frostbite, and tell the other person because you won't feel it. It's like sunburn. So that character, by the way, there's another part of the story which he was a big part of, Valentin Gorbachev. We had so much problem with breakdowns, mechanical breakdowns. In this case, the track pins every day we'd be replacing the pins that would hold the plates on the tracks together, would break, brittle fracture, because there was so much bang and smashing cold, the steel would get very brittle and break. So we're constantly hammering out the broken ones and replacing them. And it's hard work. If you look at that guy, Valeri, here on the right, now he was a very strong man, but look how he's standing. He's exhausted. Because just remember, we're typically at 3,000 metres. Most of this trip, I'll show you the contour in a minute, we were travelling for most of the journey at an elevation of 3,000 metres. That's high. It's cold, like it was -40 to -50 most of the time. That was the typical temperatures. You're working really hard. The oxygen is a lot less than what you have at sea level. And the food and the diet and sleep, and they're all heavy smokers. You add all that up and exhaustion, you're just constantly exhausted. So you had to share these physical tasks around. And not just hammering track pins, but removing the gearbox and doing all this with no tools basically and no spare parts. I mean, we got into all kinds of trouble constantly. So this is the interior picture of the Belloc, that vehicle I showed you a little while ago, our luxurious living van. And here we are preparing gnocchi, which was a much better meal than we ever got at the station at Muni. And we're just peeling the potatoes, but I've got to be careful of digressing too far. One observation of the potatoes, have you ever seen potatoes that are like 12 months old? What they look like?
Yeah, there's one in my drawer the other day.
Yeah, well, that's what we were basically peeling. So you start off with a potato this big and you end up with something that's by the time you've peeled away all the black stuff and all those shoots and rotting in the green bits and
But that's
You
what I
end
make
up
the
with-
vodka out of, though.
yeah, they do. Yeah, they do. Yeah. Anyway, that's what we're doing. We made a very nice gnocchi. And so here's Slava.
Oh,
He at this point, I said the operating table because what I forgot to mention so far was that Valentin Gorbachev, who you saw a moment ago with the icy beard, while we were on our trip, got appendicitis. And Slava had to operate on Gorbachev on that table and not using the axe. But the axe was very handy for cracking peppercorns in this case, because like I said, we had no tools or anything much. We had bagfuls of black peppercorns. You know, it's just typical. All stuff you don't need, but the stuff you do need. So that's where innovation's really helpful. And Slava had done this before. But also notice a Nescafe on the table. I have been asked, where the hell did that come from? Russians don't drink Nescafe. So that came from Mawson, because when I went from Mawson on the aircraft, I must have had half a ton full of provisions, not for myself personally, but to share around. Most of it stayed at the station, but we took a fair bit out on the Travis. I didn't need to take vodka, but I had whiskey, beer, cigarettes, magazines, Vegemite, condiments of all description, wine. And this is again a lovely interior shot. Once again, the operating table. And this picture was taken about a week after we left. It was New Year's Eve. And of course, Russians don't celebrate Christmas, they celebrate New Year. So we had a lovely party. And I'll explain who. So I mentioned there were 9 people, and I was the only native English speaker of the 9. The guy that took the photo, Slava, is not pictured. He was the one I just showed you. So this is Vladimir, a very young Vlad, who would have been at the time about 35, 36. That's me sitting next to him, sporting a moustache and hair. This is Serge. He was the 24-year-old driver and mechanic. This is Valentin Gorbachev with the same surname as the past ex-president, USSR. He's the guy that got appendicitis and had it removed on this table here. Without anesthetic. I'll get to that in a minute. This is Serge, the
Lots of vodka.
yeah, lots of vodka. Serge, radio operator. Valentin, he was also an electronic technician, the same as the other Valentin. There are 2 Valentins. And this is Serge. He was a scientist and magnetologist as well, but not doing that job on this trip. He was acting as the cook. Now, normally what happens is the doctor is expected to be the cook on these Travises, but Slava didn't like cooking and wasn't very good at it. So Serge stepped up and came with us to do that. And he was quite good considering what he had to work with. And Valery, the chief mechanic. And here are our bunks here. You can see the lighting, 2 incandescent lights. So you consider that as an operating theatre. It's pretty luxurious. What you can't see in that picture is the diesel stove and all the soot that comes with the heater as well. So let's talk about the appendicectomy. We were quite a long way from home. We got to the end of the line at Domesin on our way back, about a week or 2 into our return journey. And Valentin rocks up to Slava and says he's got a sore stomach, like really searing pain in the stomach. And Slava wasn't just an ordinary GP, he was actually an abdominal surgeon. So he was the perfect person to really handle the situation. He immediately diagnosed appendicitis, and we immediately had what are we going to do now situation. So we all sat down and we considered all sorts of things. Are we going to make a dash back for the station? What do we send an aircraft out, or sort of thing? So there was no chance of either of those things happening. If you look at but you can see the aircraft, obviously it flew out after the operation, not before, because they couldn't get out for weather reasons. When Slava decided to operate, like he just had to deal with whatever he had, because the alternative was that Gorbachev was going to die. That was the situation. So anyway, look at the surface. It's very flat. There's nothing, but it's soft. So the sleds are typically making tracks that are about 400 to 500 mils deep, and a lot of the time that Belloc was just dragging along on the belly, and the sled, runners were actually above the ground. It was that soft for a lot of that country out there. So anyway, they sent the aircraft out to us to drop medical supplies, because Slava didn't have antibiotics and a lot of stuff. And this is a picture of that. By this stage, Slava had operated, and this operation seemed to go okay. But of course, what he was worried about, Slava, was infection. Not really sure how that was going to go. So hence antibiotics and whatever. And we just stayed there for a few days while we tried to sort that out. And the aircraft, you can see, is about to drop stuff to us. The door at the back, you can see, is open here, little open door, and the skis are up, and you can see how the wind's blowing. Because for all the rest of us, were powerless to influence whether things went well or badly. So all we cared about was getting a good photo. And absolutely. It sounds callous, but like you just deal with the cards you've got, and that's what the situation was.
It's a magnificent photo.
Sorry?
That's a magnificent photo.
It is a good photo, yeah. So the other thing to notice, see how the smoke is not going up.
I was going to ask.
Yes, it's going down.
Yeah.
So the chief, Valeri, had this, when the aircraft was coming out, he had this great idea. He thought he'd get some rags, oily rags, and take them out and light a bonfire. Like this makes sense in Australia or somewhere else, make a smoke signal. So guess what happens to the smoke? It goes down onto the ground, and it makes it harder to find us, because it's just like fog. So it had the complete opposite effect.
Why does the smoke go down?
Because it's an inversion, basically, yeah. And so the smoke, the hot air doesn't rise, it just gets trapped by the warmer air above. And we're higher, but we're at 3,000 meters. We're pretty high. Anyhow, so this is what we dealt with after the boxes came out the door. They just vaporized like a bomb when they hit the ground. Look at the crater those. This is the heavy track pins in those boxes. And the medical supplies were in separate parcels that were wrapped in blankets. So they kind of bounced like a little bounce bomb, and they were okay. And of course, the guys I mentioned are heavy smokers. So on top of the list, after the antibiotics and the more bandages, please. And the top of the list was 10 cartons of cigarettes, please. That was first priority. Yeah, first priority was 10 cartons. And they were very disappointed. They only got 4 cartons. They were pretty cranky. And here they were, guys running around to pick up all the track pins the next day. They were scattered far and wide across the surface. But that medical catastrophe was only exceeded by another event. This wasn't the actual event, but it just showed you the kind of catastrophes we actually had mechanically. And it also demonstrates why it was so important to have 2 vehicles, not just one. Because if you get into a situation like this, you need the other vehicle to help to pull the vehicle back onto its tracks. That's what there's a little crane jib at the front you can see for, lifting stuff around. And we didn't have much in the way of turfers or bloody pulleys and, fancy gear. It was just brute force, but you couldn't do it manually. So this RTT at the front, about a week or two after this picture was taken, we ended up abandoning that vehicle. We had to leave it behind after it caught fire. So like we had on this trip, I mean, it was so exciting. And that's why my story is totally unique. Like it's never happened in the history of Antarctic exploration that I know of where anybody has removed an appendix out in the field. It happens commonly, and it's very unusual to get in a situation where you're abandoning vehicles like that. So we had the two things combined. But as you can see, here I am, I'm still alive. But Kerry's premonition, it was, and that wasn't the only event. It was pretty accurate. And there is another thing I talk about in the story, which isn't so easy to explain in a dramatic way, where I thought, which was the only time I really did think I was going to die. But it's in the book. I thought right out in the middle of nowhere, I thought I was going to disappear in a crevasse. And even though I knew it was just completely against any common sense and science, I knew that there couldn't be crevasses out there, but there was an event, which was the real thing that really scared me, much more than any of this stuff. Anyway, we abandoned that after 10 later on. And this is where it all happened. So here's Muni, here's Dome C, Casey, Vostok. So Muni to Vostok is a very similar distance to Muni to Dome C, around about 1,500 kilometres. You can see here the 3,000 metre contour I've drawn here. And that, so Vostok's at, I think, about 4,300 metre elevation. And Dome C is, I don't know, 3,500 metres, something like that. And we were hugging that 3,000 metre contour most of the time. So this is high. You climb quite steeply from the coast up onto the, they call it the plateau. 3,000 metres. And Mount Kosciuszko is 2,200 metres. So you're pretty much at an elevation of the Andes, like if you've been to Cusco, that's the kind of elevation. And if you have done those sort of trips, you know how a lot of people can be quite affected by altitude sickness. And it's not dependent on whether you've got a medical problem, or you're fit or you're not fit, or you're overweight or not. It's something to do with you, ears and whatever, and it's a bit random. So that's where the appendectomy occurred here. And this is where we abandoned the vehicle 2 weeks later. So like after we got over the appendectomy, which was drama of the highest order, about 3 or 4 days later, we couldn't care less about Gorbachev and his bloody appendix, because we were all in huge trouble. And the story about how we got out of that, again, it's a bit complicated to explain, but basically we were helped out by returning tractor trains coming back from Vostok. So cut a long story short, that's how we got home. Some people ask me how I communicated, or did I communicate with Australia or whatnot. So the plan was that I would use amateur radio to communicate with both work colleagues and Kerry. Primarily Kerry was what I was more worried about. And these cards, if any of you are amateur radio operators, were back in the day, people would send postcards to confirm that they'd made contact with each other across the world. These days, it's all done with an email. And you can see from the cards, I talked to people all over the world. So imagine I'm sitting in the back of that Kharkovchenko with an amateur radio and a whip antenna, and I'm talking to some guy in Khartoum and telling him all about our problems on the Soviet traverse in the Antarctic. And I was just constantly being bombed by amateur radios operators in Japan. But look, Chicago, Bulgaria, Monaco, Hong Kong, Sweden. I talked to everybody except Kerry. I think there was a couple of occasions, and they were actually usually by relayed conversations through an operator that could hear me and hear Kerry, but we couldn't hear each other. So the amateur radio and from to and from the Antarctic is fraught with problems due to polar cap absorption, which is another unique issue with the ionosphere and how all the technical lingo. But yeah, so I only talked to Kerry once or twice, very poor conversations. But again, it was just such an incredible experience. So after all that happened, we eventually struggled our way back to intersect with the returning tractor trains from Vostok. And this is just a picture of us gathering. And if any of you did sit through that presentation last year from Tim Medhurst, did anyone hear?
Yeah.
Yeah. So these are the same guys, or not all of them, but some of them are. In fact, that Karkovchanka you saw that we used was in the pictures that Tim would have showed you. I know I've seen them. I said, that's the same Karkovchanka.
Yeah.
And some of those guys there were ones that Tim mixed with, because when Tim met up with them, they were on their way out to Vostok. And when we met up with them, this is months later, they're on their way back on the second resupply traverse. But you can see here again that they're also having trouble with the vehicle. See, that one's broken down and they're towing it home. Well, of course, we couldn't tow our broken down RTT back. First of all, it was way too far away. And we only had one Karkovchanka and we had to tow a fuel sled, and, you know, we just didn't have the towing capacity to also tow the Karkovchanka, to tow the RTT, sorry. So now we're getting towards the end of the trip. So the whole, from start to finish, the whole experience I'm talking about here was 5 months. So I left Australia in November, eventually got home after Easter, about April, late April in 84. So I left in 83, got back in 84. Here, this picture here just shows you us coming down the slope back to Muni, and you can see a rock outcrop there underneath the aircraft, which is the little peninsula where Muni Station is located, and a vehicle coming out to greet us. And of course, there's quite a few vehicles here that again were part of the returning Vostok team. And the aircraft, it was quite traditional. If tractor trains were in the vicinity, the aircraft would come down and they'd swoop like a magpie. It was really dramatic. They'd swoop, and I mean, these guys were gung ho. They loved that sort of stuff, and they'd wave the wings and off they'd go. And everyone would be jump down from the vehicles, and we'd all be waving and taking photos, and it was great fun. But this was actually the most dangerous part of the journey, because excuse me, as you're coming down the slope to Muni again, you're dealing with crevassed regions, with heavy crevassing. So it's quite important to follow somebody who actually knew the best path through that area where it was safest, and follow the tracks in front of you, don't stray from the path. So it was actually, you had to do that in good light during the day. It was important to stay on the right path. So I'll show you just a few more pictures of the Muni station without talking too much about it. But this is taken from the top Dom radio, looking down slope to the and all those icebergs and sea out at sea. I was actually living in a room here in what was called Dom Geophysics, the science block. And this building at the top was where the mess was, and a lot of other living accommodation. And so for every meal, I'd have to walk up that slope and back to go to meals. And they weren't particularly good meals, you know, so I really gave quite a bit of thought about whether I'd bother or not on occasion. So you might think that what you're thinking might not be quite what I was thinking. What I was worried about, you'd have to get fully dressed to make that march up to the top. Because even though you can see in that picture there, nice blue skies, the weather looks beautiful, in the course of that half an hour or an hour that you're sitting up at the building at the top there, a blizzard could arrive, because we're on the coast now where you get a lot of blizzards. What I didn't mention, by the way, all of that traverse at 3,000 metres, we didn't get any blizzards. You don't get blizzards up on the plateau. We did get, well, that's not quite true. We did get one situation where bad weather came in, but it wasn't a full-blown blizzard like you get on the coast. So you had to get totally properly dressed. And then when you get to the mess, you had to take all that windproof gear off, boots, hang it up, and then put it all on when you walk back. So the whole affair of going to have a 20-minute sea lunch would take quite a bit of time and effort. and for a particularly ordinary reward. So a lot of guys used to just cook potatoes in the room and not bother. So every day now, so I've done the 3-month trip to Domesday and back, and I spent a month sitting there at Mooney waiting for news of how I was going to get home. And by this time it's April and the sea ice is starting to freeze up and the voyages are less frequent and the ships are finding it very difficult to get into Muni. And there was a point, and I'm not kidding, I thought like Douglas Mawson, I was going to be sitting there for the rest of the year stranded. And that was a real possibility and another one of the tick list of Kerry's concerns. Now I'd been married for less than a year, so I wasn't particularly anxious to get held over for another year. And what happened was, at the last minute, they had an icebreaker come into Muni and then sort of disappear. And it actually went down the coast 10 kilometres and parked against an ice cliff. And the ship that we were going to travel on, the Baikal, you'll see a picture of it in a moment, was a passenger vessel. It sort of went back out to sea. And so quite a complicated arrangement to get home. We had to jump in lifeboats and go 10 kilometres down the coast. And I had a lot of gear and expensive gear that I didn't want to lose. So it was just chucked into that first lifeboat and everyone trampled over everything, and huddled up. We got to the icebreaker and got lifted up in the nets like cattle, standing on a crate and dumped onto the deck. What you can't see in this picture here is you can sort of see a little bit of an outline here. That's a big ice cliff at the back there. So they've got the icebreaker nudged up to an ice cliff, and that's to protect it from the katabatic winds that's flowing across the top of the ship. So off we get onto the Gotsky, the Kapitan Gotsky, which was an icebreaker. Then the next thing was, how are we going to get onto the Baikal, which was the ship that I was supposed to travel on back to Australia? The way I did that, look at that thing. It does not look like an icebreaker because it wasn't. It was a ferry about the size of the Princess of Tasmania sort of thing. And so it's gingerly following the Baikal through the leads in the sea ice. And they managed to find a place where they could pull them together at the nose. And then and it was all this happened at night, they threw nets across, they pulled them up together at the nose, threw nets across some planks like a gangplank, like pirates. Floodlights come on, they're all shouting in Russian. It was like a James Bond film set. And we just had to scurry across the planks from one ship to the other. That's how we got across. It was like performing rats, and I had all these bags and I had to rely on the help of some of the guys from Molodeshin and other colleagues to help me get all my bags.
Workplace health and safety there.
There was zero workplace health and safety. If you've been on a tourist voyage, you got ship manifests and everything's recorded, none of that. And everything's in Russian. They're all yelling and screaming in Russian. And I'm trying to understand what the hell's going on. But basically, it's got your stuff, let's go. That was basically the message. But Baikal was a tourist ship, so there's benefits. And as you can see here, Kerry first saw this picture at a neighbour's slideshow, much like we're doing today, and was a bit surprised by the dancing girls.
Yeah, you said you went to Antarctica.
Yeah, that's right. You said well, I guarantee you that on Australian Antarctic voyages, you do not get dancing girls. On the current Noyena or the Neladan, no dancing girls. But look at the men on the right, they're all enjoying lapping it up, nicely shaved, clean clothes. So I didn't recognise anybody because, I've gotten used to, you forming these memories or, your friends, you recognise them by what they're wearing, a scraggy purple parka or a funny beard and so I'd have to listen to them speak and look at them in the eyes, and then maybe I'd recognise who I was talking to. And you can see there's a band at the back, guy on the trumpet at the right here, and a guy on the trumpet here, and a guy on drums, and the two guitarists. So it's a full-blown band. I mean, that was fantastic, but the food was still rubbish. I thought, we're on a tourist ship. Hooray, we'll get some nice borscht or some nice foods. No, it was exactly like it was at the station, just more pasta and liver steak. So for a one day, I was famous when we got back to Fremantle. Kerry knitted this jumper, by the way. I did. Yeah, I had a diplomatic passport because I didn't know where they were going to drop me, as it was fortunate that it was Fremantle, but could have been anywhere in the world, depending on exactly how they were going to get and where the men had to get dropped off back in the Soviet Union, exactly which side and how they were going to get back, you know. So, I mean, one of my previous colleagues had been dropped off at the Canary Islands, and I thought, that sounds pretty good. Yeah, that's what I'm aiming for. But unfortunately, it was Fremantle, so I had to give back my diplomatic passport with no stamps, and I was a bit like the guys with the cigarettes. I was a bit disappointed about that. So I'm going to finish on this slide. I've talked about the state of the East Antarctic ice sheet and the mass balance, and the fact that with current technology, science still is a bit unsure about the state of balance. You see, the big risk at the moment is what's happening under the water, which you can't see. And there's been a lot of effort in recent years to try to understand that dynamics, but we know the oceans are warming and melting, so they're worried about the undercutting of the outlet glaciers, particularly the big ice shelves, and trying to understand that a lot better. Because what might happen if disaster occurs is there'll be a massive surge. You know, if you're melting away the grounding line and that's retreating under the water, all of a sudden the gravity and the weight behind it's just going to punch. So that's the big worry. Anyhow, this satellite here is called the NISAR satellite, which launched in July. And I'm no expert, but I know its purpose is to understand the cryosphere much better and hopefully throw more light on the issue of particularly the Antarctic ice mass. But what it will do is map the entire topography of the Earth every 13 days. Now, I don't know if you guys have known more than me about this technology, but anyway, it's a joint project between NASA and India. And this is just a mock-up of what it's doing. And it's effectively mapping the topography of the Earth, and it does that every 13 days. So it's going to produce a massive amount of information that will be of all kinds of applications, useful for all kinds of applications, particularly in civil engineering, bridge movements and crops and all sorts of things to do with deforestation, whatever. So on that note, if there's any questions, happy to answer them. And for those who might be interested, what I've spoken about today is, of course, a visual summary of the book, which I'm happy to offer a copy if you want to for $30. With Christmas coming, a lot of people actually, it's a nice little gift to give to friends or after you've read it yourself. And also I've done a few little watercolours, which are hugely inexpensive, for basically just the cost of the materials. Anyhow, thank you for inviting me. Are there any questions?
Sort of aside from you, sorry. I just recently read the book, which has gone out of my head, about the Belgian people who were the first overwinter people in the Antarctic in 1890. You know, that was an unbelievable.
The Belgica expedition with Adrienne de Gerlache. The Belgica. That is a fantastic book. Kerry and I have both read that.
Madness at the End of the World or something like that.
That's it. Yeah, the Madhouse at the End of the World. And it was, look, that was so well written, and I enjoyed reading it too. And that was Amundson's first expedition to the Antarctic as a young man, as a first officer, I think he was on that trip. Yeah.
And so they had nothing, but then when you look at the Russian aircraft now, and look like DC-3. But the truck also looked like a Studebaker, really, you know, the Russian version of a Studebaker. But the mechanics, I just can't sort of, the coal, as you said, breaking all the steel, you know.
Well, of course, just also remember, it's all very dramatic, but they're at sea level, right? So just remember this, that it doesn't get that cold in coastal Antarctic stations, really. You know, I mean, I spent a year at Casey. Well, most of the time, I think it was 7 or 8 months in total, I was inland out of the station. But it doesn't, like -25 is cold in an Antarctic station, coastal station, that's cold. But I just talked about Vostok, -89. When I was at Vostok, it was -25. And it wasn't until I was writing this book and looking up, doing a bit of research, what is the maximum temperature of Vostok, I thought. And I found out the maximum is -14. And I had this, oh, hell, I was there during a heat wave,
Yeah.
like at -25. But so -25 isn't really that bad. I mean, if you've lived in Canada or, you know, even in America, whatnot, you'd be used to those sort of temperatures. And so my point being, that story of Munster and the Gerlach's expedition, it's not that cold. I mean, they're at sea level. They certainly had privations and hardships to deal with that. Nothing like anybody today has to deal with. Finding food by shooting seals and all that sort of thing.
And so is the Russian nation, well, we saw the photograph that it's really improved to what they are now, sort of thing. So their equipment is a lot better now, I suppose, than what it.
Well, presumably. However, I think that Muni and a lot of the other stations would not have changed at all. You know, I think that probably Putin in particular, being the sort of person he is, has a political objective in mind. I mean, they're very controlling of the Arctic, you know. So, I mean, a lot of people who have been, like Tim, for example, who skied to the North Pole, whatever, a common way to do that is to use some of the Russian Antarctic outposts to get there. Yeah. But they make do with the most, you know, they just have so much more experience and understanding of that climate, and they make do with things in a different way to what, say, the Americans or Australians and Brits do.
We just expect a lot more, I suppose, you know, they're used to it.
I had this, like the radio, the amateur radio I took was a military spec radio. It was quite big and heavy. Now these two guys, the two Valentines, were electronic technicians, and they were busting to take the case off and have a look inside. And they were very dismissive of this American technology. Oh, that's rubbish, you know, because their radios, valve radios, I suppose, I don't know. But all I can tell you, we had Serge, a radio operator, had this old, he called it old Dadushka, you know, old grandpa, that worked sometimes and often it didn't work, and it was only, you know, for Morse code and AM. It couldn't pick up. Yeah, well, it couldn't, it was a really crappy radio, basically. And at one point we started listening to Radio Australia and Radio Moscow using my Astro C. But the funny thing was that, I guess the point of the story is that they were always picking on me, the two Valentines, about this crappy Astro C and mocking it, you know, because it was just completely, you know, it was state of the art electronics in the day, but it also had problems because of the cold. So, you know, rubber drive belts and things like that, not in that radio, but in the, I had this amplifier in the antenna of the JMR, and it was fine, and it had a rubber drive belt in this preamp, which I didn't know about, but I couldn't work out why it wasn't working. And when it was fine down to temperatures of like -25, -30, fine. But when you started getting much colder temperatures, where we were most of the time, then it wouldn't work. So there were all these sort of things, technology-wise.
So do you keep in contact, or did you keep in contact?
Now, that's a good question, and often people ask me. The answer is yes, I keep in contact with Vlad, and Kerry and I have been over to Washington now. So Vlad emigrated to the USA in early 90s when the Soviet Union was breaking up. Actually, his wife was a more senior scientist than him. So my understanding of how all that happened was that she was the way they got the green card, and they call themselves Russian Americans, live in Washington, and now he administers the science program at South Pole. So he's had a very long career in science and is transitioning to retirement this year. And he's a few years older than me, but because he really had to start life again, you know. But he's quite comfortable and well established now. So yes, I stay in contact with Vlad, but he's a very busy person, and he's been out to Australia to meet us, and we've been, yeah, visit our kids' schools. That was about 20 years. Yeah, that was about 30 years ago that happened. Yeah, like, we've been over to his dasher in the, up north. Adirondacks, yes, his dasher in the Adirondacks. You know, the Russians love to have their country house in the woods, somewhere in the woods, so he's got one of those. But I haven't kept in touch with the other crew who went back to Moscow for political reasons, and even Vlad doesn't know, he's lost contact with them all. But, you know, Vlad's had a long career. He's been to Antarctica 25 times, 15 times the South Pole. So this trip, for me, is like the ultimate. For Vlad, it's just one of many, but it still is his peak experience, I would say, because of that adventure aspects that I just talked about.
And does he speak English?
Oh yes, of course. He spoke better English than I spoke Russian, and at the time, so I used to rely on him a fair bit. You know, back in school days where people can be a bit cruel, you know, and you might have. I know when I was in high school, we had, you know, people with coming from Europe that couldn't speak English very well, and the kids would start to speak louder and speak in stultifying language that actually was more difficult to understand than if you just spoke normally. And all it was really required is to slow down and not use complicated words, just use simple language. So I found myself in exactly that situation. It was the most amazing experience to be on the receiving end, and to be constantly asking people to just slow down and speak slowly and use simple language. But don't yell at me. Don't raise the volume. That doesn't help, you know.
Anybody got any other questions?
Yes, just the background diplomacy at the time. You know, Soviet Union versus.
Okay, this is a great question. So 1983, do you remember any significant events from 1983? So I'll give you a couple. The Korean airliner incident, do we remember that? Where they shot down over the Kamchatka Peninsula, Russians did, killed all that whole, and it's been repeated with a couple since, and it was so it's a long way back now in time, but you know, when you're getting older, it doesn't seem that long ago. So I left to go on this expedition 3 months after the Korean airliner incident. So I thought that was it. I wasn't going to be able to go, you know, but the diplomacy didn't seem to affect me at all. And there was another reason why I had a diplomatic passport, because the political tension was like it is now. It was the height of it, really was still the height of the Cold War. You remember Gary Powell's incident in the 60s when the U-2 got shot down over spy plane over Soviet Union. And so 20 years later, when they shot down this in reverse circumstances, sorry, it wasn't reverse, but when they shot down this plane over the Kamchatka Peninsula, you could understand how these things happen, given if you know much about the U-2 incident and Gary Powell's back in 1961, you can really understand why that happened. So I really thought I was gone. I was going to get the opportunity. So anyway, the first night that I was at Munich, guess what we talked about, you know, over many vodkas, was that Korean airline incident. And Vlad still makes a point today about things I implied, you know, and he's not defensive, but he just reminds me. And he said, don't blame the population because of the authoritarian leadership and the things that happened at that level. Don't blame the ordinary person for that, because they were very upset about it, just like everybody else in the world. And like, I can't say enough how similar the political situation or relationship was to today, you know, with Putin and whatever, you know. Yeah, interesting times, very interesting.
So, you know, back in, you know, Flinders' day, they were fighting French and that, but they had these scientific passports. So was your passport anything referenced, anything like that from
No,
time?
just purely a green passport. But I was very proud to have a diplomatic passport, but I only had it for 6 months and then got
So that
quickly
was
cut up on
issued by the Australian
yeah,
government?
Australian government. Yeah. And also 1983, Star Wars, Ronald Reagan and his Star Wars. That was peak Star Wars. Of course, it never came to fruition. And it was all about what we're seeing today in the war with Ukraine, shooting down blooming.
Drones.
Yeah, and instead of drones, there was going to be satellites with some sort of fancy laser equipment. And that was the paranoia that the world was in then between the West and the East, just like it is today. A little bit different, but very similar in many other ways. So fascinating time to do that.
Well,
Thank you very much.
thank you so much, Trevor. I thought it was going to be an intriguing tale, and you proved that right.
My pleasure. Thank
And
you.
it was good of you to be able to come along and talk to us. So a round of applause.